legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Royce Christyn, who joins us to discuss how a deeper understanding of science and psychology can aid positive thinking and manifesting practices. Christyn's new book, Scripting the Life You Want, is so much more than just another how-to manifesting handbook. It is an exploration of the cutting-edge science which makes manifesting possible. Unlike many who claim to offer the secret of creating the life you really want, Christyn goes beyond the simplistic and superficial routines which leave so many seekers frustrated to uncover the hidden mechanisms which shape our reality. Mechanisms understood by magicians of ages past and by media manipulators of the present day, which can be mastered by individuals to take control of their lives in these turbulent times. If you're not truly in control of your life, you can be sure that someone else is. But without insight into how our reality is created, self-mastery may remain a mystery. Hello and welcome, Royce, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
Royce, today we're going to be talking about your brand new book that's entitled Scripting the Life You Want, Manifest Your Dreams with Just Pen and Paper. Before we dive into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background, your work and career, and also in my recorded introduction I said a little bit about the main topic of our discussion, New Thought, what many people know as positive thinking, and I normally invite guests to talk about their personal background, and in your case, your personal background, your growing up was very much steeped in New Thought and positive thinking. So just grab any and all of that and let us know what you want to.
You're going to make me do the intro of myself, huh? No, I'm kidding. I actually prefer that because I it's very awkward sometimes to sit here and have people read off my bio. Like you said, I actually hate the term New Thought. Of course, it's one of those things. It's like the necessary evil, where it's really the only phrase that exists to kind of encapsulate this entirety of a self-help movement and positive thinking and law of attraction and meditation. And I just personally think we're so much deeper and further along than just thinking. Obviously, that's what my book's about. So like you said, I grew up with a family that encouraged and really taught me from a very young age the principles of meditation and positive thinking, and the idea that you can create your own reality. And people who read my book will see from the very first chapter I talk about my mom and my grandma, and when all my other friends were going to their different religious schools, or Sunday school or Hebrew school or what have you, I was on Sundays usually learning the power of positive thinking and meditation and whatever it would be that week. So definitely that part of my growing up was very different. But like you said, I have a very strange and funny background. I was an actor for years. I mean, I'm only 32, so I did that as a child in theater, and then I moved to LA when I was 16, and I was on Nickelodeon, and I was on the Disney Channel. One of the big stories that I talk about in my book is that I ended up using my manifestation practices to book a role as Selena Gomez's boyfriend on the sitcom Wizards of Waverly Place, which was also on Disney Channel. So after that, my late teens, early 20s, I became a writer and documentary director, and behind the scenes I've been coaching a lot of high-end real estate clients and business professionals and sports people and everything else on just really using science and a lot of the principles of New Thought to create what they want in their lives. So that's what I've been doing for a while. And finally, a bunch of my friends said, you really need to start writing this down because this is interesting stuff. And, you know, I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad I listened. And this is my first book. It's called Scripting the Life You Want. So I'm really happy that we're here, and It's seeming to connect with people. And obviously, we talked off air a little bit. It's not really a book just on manifesting. It's kind of I think it definitely does a 180 halfway through.
I eventually came to what we can loosely call New Thought via ritual magic. And when I was first reading about that, it was setting out magic, the very simple terms as, the science and art of causing, change through power of your will. That is the idea that mind can affect matter. And there was some science around that when in the 1980s, when I first began to explore it. But then magic led me on to, to New Thought, positive thinking. But one of the things that throughout all the reading that I did, there was very, very little of what I really wanted to try and probe, which was the mechanics of this. How could this possibly work? If you had some, psychic researchers researching mind and matter and the relationship between the two, where they overlap and how one can affect the other, but that never seemed to be directly mapped onto the ideas, the traditions of magic, or, the traditions of positive thinking and New Thought, any of this ability that we have to directly affect our environment. So, and that was frustrating for a long time for me. And I think that the result of that has been that many magical practitioners, but especially members of the public, who are not otherwise interested in the esoteric, shall we say, who come to positive thinking through popular books, they get frustrated and they basically go nowhere with it because they either don't believe it can work or they don't have any inkling of what the mechanisms might be. And when you begin to probe that, I think it lends a lot of weight to the ideas. And as you said a moment ago, that's really what you're exploring here in the book.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. I also, I grew up in the early 90s and 2000s, and now we're at, 2020 now. And there wasn't a ton of science out there, at least, that was starting to bridge the worlds of what we consider, spirituality, magic, manifestation with science. And I think that's, I am a person who just digs and digs and digs, and I'm that very annoying, nerdy guy who just wants to know why everything works. So, by nature, just, growing up in this world, but also, in acting, all you do is you study every facet of whether it's a character or an environment. We're basically taught to be really, really great researchers. And then as I grew older and I started to work in documentaries and I started to really focus on writing, I mean, what do you do there? You research. So, I definitely wanted to bring the fact that there is so much concrete evidence and so much science and so many papers out there that proves to a lot of people who, like you said, might be on the edge or don't want to take it further, but it proves what we're starting to see, what we've really known about for decades and even centuries in the case of magic. Science is finally catching up, and in a lot of cases, they're actually looking towards the spiritual communities, the communities, like you said, even of magic, esoteric, whatever you want to call that. The science community is looking to them to say, oh, okay, wait, what blanks can we help fill in here? So it's been fascinating, and, like you said, for my book, it's interesting because there were really two main issues that I had personally with most books on manifestation. And the first one was the laziness. And I say this lovingly because obviously I have so many writers and other authors that I admire. Not every one of them is lazy, but there was a laziness when it came to the science. And one of the big ones you would always hear is quantum physics or quantum mechanics just sort of thrown around and just say that explains it. That's how manifesting works. So I made sure, because I am a giant science nerd, I think it's a 25-page actual hardcore explainer, if you will, of quantum mechanics is in my book. But, quantum mechanics doesn't explain everything, and I think that's actually a good thing because there's a lot of other sciences that to me are more interesting, like neuroscience and audiology, the science of hearing. There's all these different worlds that are proving things that, to us explain why manifestation works, why magic works, but also I think it's fascinating to watch the worlds of science and spirituality sort of collide right now. So that was the first thing I really wanted to cover. And the second one, for me personally, that I really would get frustrated with when I would look at a lot of the books and things out there, materials on manifestation, was people didn't like to talk about the fact that sometimes things just don't manifest or it doesn't work. And that was something that, I think a lot of my clients and students that I've had over the last decade really appreciate it, which were, I like to talk about the science of memetics and memes and, all these different things that sort of explain how not all of our thoughts come to us from us. Obviously we've known about that when it comes to advertising or, subliminals or all these things, but it's actually a lot less scary than people think it is because it's a lot easier to fix. But in the same token, no one ever wanted to talk about this fact that just sometimes people don't manifest what they want, or they manifest things and really bad stuff happens later. There was all these different areas of that I really wanted to cover in this book. So that was what I landed on, was I really wanted to teach people how to manifest, but I also wanted to give the skeptics out there, which are the ones I love to work with, here's all the science you need. And if anything, this book, at least in 20, 30 years, people can always go back to it if they have their really skeptical friend and they could take it off their bookshelf and say, here, and they could go through the last 5 chapters. So that was the big one. And the other one was explaining to people why sometimes things don't manifest or don't manifest completely or maybe manifest differently, and then also what they could do to fix that. So those are the 2 areas that I really wanted to focus on when I wrote this.
Well, yeah, we'll get to memetics shortly because that's extremely important. As far as quantum physics goes, you're absolutely correct to point out this, of course, has been much, misconstrued and misrepresented, often very lazily, even by well-meaning people. They look at some of the, revelations of quantum mechanics that, as the 20th century went by, and particularly into the early 21st, and it just seems to explain so much, doesn't it? But it's rather too easy to put 2 and 2 together and get 5. And I think concepts like non-locality and the idea that future, that the outcomes can affect causes and what have you, that led a lot of people to sort of make an easy mapping across to new thought principles.
Right. You're 100% correct. I think part of the thing that I noticed was there was a lot of, I don't really have a better word, but regurgitation. There was a lot of, it seemed to me, and, I read pretty much everything. So every science book and research paper and textbook, but also every book that is put out. And what I started to notice was it seemed to me that a lot of authors were, reading other authors that they enjoyed or they admired and sort of putting their own spin on quantum physics. But what happened was no one was really going back to the source material. So that was something that I noticed, at least in the early 21st century, especially the first 5 to 10 years of the 2000s. There's a lot of great books, but they just don't quite nail quantum physics at all. So that's why I really wanted to at least give the good side and the bad side of why it explains it and why it doesn't. But like you just mentioned, there's been a lot of shifts and changes in science, and you said that in the introduction, where there was just nothing to give anyone who was interested in the stuff that you and I are anything to really explain why it worked. The last 5 to 10 years has been almost an overload of why things like what we're talking about work.
Well, for a lot of people, for a lot of lay people, any understanding that they have whatsoever, or an understanding they believe they have of quantum physics, has come to them through popular channels. It may well have been, Manifest Your Dreams type books, in the sort of spirituality section in the bookstore. I did 5 years of physics in the 1980s, at high school level. And
oh, wow.
Of course, Einstein was mentioned. When I say 5 years of physics, I mean as a module, along with everything else.
Well, still, it's better than a lot of people can say.
Now, of course, Einstein was mentioned, and quantum physics may have been mentioned as a field of study, but we didn't do anything on it whatsoever. Now, you would have thought by the late 1980s that it would be a sufficiently developed field that teenagers could cope with having some of the basics explained. So the reason I mention this is because the first time I came to it was through, I don't remember what the book would have been now, but it would have been through a popular science book, essentially.
Right.
Which a very diluted kind of understanding of it. So it's perhaps no wonder that it's been easy for new thought writers and thinkers in the 21st century and people who want are looking for that material to, race to conclusions that aren't really there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most interesting things. You just brought up about 3 really fascinating points. I think, even in my own high school, I loved physics and I loved biology. I loved science. I was in the college courses of science in my high school. So I totally understand. And as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, I think the books that I had in, 2002, 2003 were probably written in the late 70s. And that was just in public school. And I'm thinking that might be part of what we experienced where the textbooks were older, but I don't know. It's interesting because we never learned about quantum physics even when I was in school, at least in my schooling, which I think was pretty excellent for public school and even any other kind of school. We had one of the better ones in the country, and I think that it is a case of people finding it or learning about it from popular culture, or maybe some sort of regurgitation of it from some other authors. That was the thing. It just was so watered down. So, for me, quantum physics points to a lot of possible paths. But as I point out in the book, and I say this lovingly because I do know some physicists, I know a lot of scientists, and some of them even endorse the book. Science is kind of a mess right now, quantum science and quantum mechanics. And anybody who reads any scientific journals or papers, or even talks to a physicist, the physicist will tell you that there is so much going on. There's so many crises going on mentally. I talked to one one person who called himself a recovering physicist or recovering quantum physicist, because there's so many unknowns and there's so many things that are shifting day to day. And he put it to me this way. He said, it's almost like finding out the answer to a problem that you concrete and 100% know you will not have any way of explaining to people for about 200 years. And you don't have any way to get like the actual, problem or calculation out to how you get the answer. It's almost like they're getting the answers first, which, is funny and sort of ironic in and of itself, because that's a little bit of what people sort of think quantum physics is. But there are just so many contradictions and just issues going on in quantum physics that, and especially lately, that even when I was doing the bulk of the research for this book back in 2016, 2017, 2018, the more months that would go by, the worse it looked. It was, and it's not because they're bad or something's wrong. It's just there are so many unknowns in that world. And I point this out in my book that it's kind of hard to, at this point, I feel personally, to use that as the only science to buffer up a system that I think a lot of people are already skeptical of, the idea of creating your own reality. And I understand there are people, even like myself, I just have this sort of curse of always kind of wanting to get into other people's heads and look at it through their eyes. So while it may be fine for me and you, or, whoever, to just have the quantum physics aspect, I knew that wasn't going to be enough for a lot of people. So that's why I made sure to get down to my knowledge, which is, the best explainer. And again, it takes about 20 pages of what is and is not quantum mechanics in my book. But then, we move on to some other really interesting research. One of my favorites being Professor Donald Hoffman, who's here in California, who has studied perception. And I've always taught perception and the brain and how we actually take in the information of the environment around us is one of the most important keys and components to understanding how we create our reality. Because just as a teacher and as a coach, I've had so many fascinating examples over the years where people really just start perceiving things that were already there, and they become these great manifestations in their lives.
Well, I think in terms of science and spirituality, these are two areas of reality, of existence that were driven apart a few centuries ago, but spent the longest time, many millennia prior to that, being intricately entwined, or at least somehow related, and you would have... They
were one and the same. I was just having this conversation with my mother, actually, a few weeks ago.
So
they were the same study. There was no separation.
Exactly. And I get the feeling, this is just sort of, obviously we look back thousands of years. If you go back to as far as we can in human history, things start to get very foggy, but from that point forward, it seems to me that there's all sorts of oscillations and undulations that take place in human history, human evolution, and our relationship to natural phenomena and the planet. And these sort of things rise and fall. And it seems to me that science and spirituality have drifted apart and drifted together again over time. And they became very far apart, basically the scientific revolution, I suppose, and perhaps the Enlightenment to an extent. But I feel that there is a convergence that's been happening. But obviously, given the background situation that we live in now, the societies we have obviously that's causing a lot of friction. But I think that's the direction of travel. And certainly I would say 2 recent guests I had with 2 very good books with a lot that listeners here may appreciate is Dean Radin, who's a psychical researcher, his book Real Magic. Steve Taylor, he's a British psychologist, his book Spiritual Science. Either of those books, you'll find interviews with both of them with those titles at legalizefreedom.com. Something else for people to dip into, but just further evidence of this convergence I feel that is underway.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. I think that is exactly what's happening. I know that is what's happening. I had we had dinner with a friend of ours who is a very well-known scientist who, I have a lot of friends in a lot of different worlds, and, that's one benefit of living the life that I've lived. I've gotten to meet a lot of interesting people over the years, and about 2 years ago I had dinner, and it was this great scientist, and they basically said exactly what you just did. And the problem being that a lot of the scientists, at least that I've spoken with, are afraid of repercussion or, what the other people in the scientific world are going to say, but, about their sort of newfound spirituality, or them realizing that the bridge is getting very strong and very short to the world of spirituality from the world of science. What I've recognized and I've seen, though, is almost every person that I've interacted with, and these are people who I didn't even know had any interest in anything, out of the ordinary. We're friends for other reasons, but, they would bring up this talk of spirituality and how everything's starting to bridge back together. And it seems to me like there's a lot of people in the world of science. There's this balloon that's about to burst at any point here, of everybody just finally saying, okay, there is a connection here. Something massive is about to happen. And, I think really to move forward, especially in the world that we're living in right now, it would only make sense for there to be a sort of, at least a mild, at the least, recombining of these worlds. But that's the coolest thing. It's nothing that, you or I or anybody have to push. Like you said, there's a lot of other authors who do this full-time. I mean, I do it full-time from a different perspective, where I don't just research the science. I like to teach people how to live the lives that they want as well. And I know that there are authors out there who are fabulous researchers and who are actual scientists, which I am not. But I think that I'm sure you, as a host of a show like this, are probably hearing this exact, sentiment, that there is a lot of, I was shocked, at least personally, to see how much the scientific world to me seems to be, and this is the very, corporate science world, the very buttoned up science world that you would never expect to be looking over at us, if you will. But they're starting to create this dialogue and communication, and it's really interesting to see, at least for me. And it's exciting because I think that a lot may have been lost, or if not lost, just sort of, I think a lot of people missed out by having that disconnection exist, as you talked about, for so long between the two worlds. And I'm not saying that there isn't a place for one or the other, and there's some benefit to having them be separate, but there is something missing. And I think that everybody on both sides has sensed this for a long time. So it's not surprising this is happening, that it's sort of bridging back together.
Well, I sometimes point skeptics to, government research programs of the past, when they're kind of saying, oh, paranormal guff, what are you on about? And, remote viewing and mind control and everything.
Yeah, then meanwhile they have like 400 different programs going on to research it. Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that funny how they do that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite often it's like, this is not for you sort of thing. We'll debunk.
We'll do it. Yeah.
We'll debunk this in public, but we'll have some people look into it sort of thing. No, I mean, I think a lot of people are quite ready to accept, even the most skeptical, they'll accept simple things that they might have learned at science class in school, that, in human beings, the spectrum, our visual spectrum, that which we can see, is limited to certain frequencies of light. The frequencies of sound that we can hear are limited. And our pets, cats and dogs, they can hear and see a bit more at either end of the extreme of the spectrum than we can, and that's fine. This is why cats sometimes appear to chase things that aren't there. It's why dogs prick up their ears when we can't hear anything, and that seems fairly uncontroversial. But I sometimes use that as a starting point to say, okay, well, just think about that. So you accept that there's something beyond your 5 senses, that there is something out there, things that some of which we've explained, Quantum physics is a very good example. All these things that we couldn't see, we couldn't be aware of without our electron microscopes and without our hadron collider and everything else. But it seems that if you class certain phenomena, they label them in a certain way, they become more or less acceptable. So, for example, to me, supernatural and paranormal, so that's just somehow above natural, outside of natural, outside of normal. Well, that what we consider normal and natural expands and contracts all the time, depending on the age that we're living in. So if you take that as a starting point and we accept that we don't understand everything, then I don't think it's such a big leap to at least look at, as you say, what new scientific advances are suggesting. But I think there's all sorts of other complex psychological reasons why people resist things like that, not least of which that people like certainty. As a species, we like certainty. We like to know that the answers are in. We don't like the idea that we don't know what's going on.
Well, I mean, my goodness, then I think if there was a time for people to start maybe paying attention and maybe accepting that, there is some other phenomenon and aspects of the world out there. I mean, no one knows what's going on right now. So this is, I think a lot of people have been really, diving into the research and reading a lot more books. And, with everything going on globally, the only thing that seems to be certain is uncertainty. So, and I say that not to, I don't like it as much as the next person, and I'm not making light of it. It's a very serious situation for a lot of people, health-wise and what have you. But if there's any thing that maybe some people are finding in sort of this hour of darkness, it seems to be that their open-mindedness is sort of re-emerging or emerging for the first time. It's funny you mentioned supernatural, because at the beginning of chapter 6, I think it's on the second or third page, I actually go through the definition of the word supernatural, because it really just is this sort of it's an actual, Oxford definition, and it's just what's beyond the visible. I mean, it's a provable existence that's really something we can't see. I mean, I go into it, it's a lot more eloquent when you read it, but even the word magic, it's just this, if you really go down to the base definitions in Merriam-Webster or in the Oxford Dictionary, I mean, the definitions are fascinating. I mean, magic is just this idea. I just opened up to it. So it's the power of influencing events by using forces relating to an order of existence beyond the visible, observable universe that transcend the currently understood laws of nature. And I think that's something that's really interesting. It's just, they say right there, that magic is something that transcends the currently understood laws of nature. And I think that's really interesting coming out of, such a prestigious dictionary as Merriam-Webster and Oxford. I mean, if you really go into these definitions of these words that people dismiss, they're not so dismissible when you look at the base, when you look at the core, when you look at what they really mean.
Well, there's lots of things that I'd previously learned about when I was young through science fiction and fantasy concepts such as the simulation hypothesis, holographic universe, multiverse. These are all things that I read about in science fiction, basically. And you find these phrases now, if you Google them, you find them cropping up in all sorts of research papers and popular science articles. But as with the basic understandings of the revelations of quantum physics, talking about the implications of any of these ideas, now obviously things like simulation and multiverse and everything, they're just hypotheses. There's, theoretical scenarios that they're trying to reach to, would some of these perhaps explain observable reality? But in any event, going to implications, I think, is where you find establishment science, and particularly the science media, the people who present science to the masses, going into all sorts of self-contradictory convulsions to say, oh yeah, that is true, that is the case, that's been measured, but it doesn't mean anything. We've observed this effect, but as far as your life is concerned and the physical world that we live in, it doesn't mean anything. It has no implications.
Right.
That quite the opposite is true.
Right. Well, that's why, I mentioned earlier, and I talk about Professor Donald Hoffman in my book a lot. He's a cognitive scientist from University of California in Irvine. And if anybody out there is listening to this, I highly recommend. He has a TED Talk from either 2015 or 2016, but it's brilliant. And what he and his research students discovered is that evolution does not favor reality. And he has been studying perception for the last 3 decades. I mean, he's studied everything, really, that we've talked about, even artificial intelligence and just sort of the idea of there being like an evolutionary game theory, if you will. But, you know, his conclusion, and there is so much science to back it up, and I lay it all out in my book, and it's only a 20-minute TED Talk, and it will blow your mind. I mean, I know it blew mine when I first saw it, but he takes you on this journey, and when you get to this sort of conclusion, you know, he gives us example of sort of the way that we see through our eyes. What is out there, what we think is our world, is more like the desktop on our computer. And, you know, we may have a folder on our desktop, on our computer, and inside of that may be something that we've written, you know, maybe a speech or a paper, but that's not actually a folder, and that's not actually a piece of paper that we've written something on, and it goes on and on. But the point being that, you know, we don't need to see all those diodes and resistors and all the electronic components of what makes up the screen to actually create the illusion of a folder. We just need to see the folder. And that's what he has discovered is a lot of the way that our brain perceives the actual reality around us. And basically, as we have evolved, our evolution has not made the perception of reality anywhere close to a priority. And one of the coolest things, and sort of scariest things, but coolest because it really allows us to dive into all of these fascinating worlds, and even the things you just mentioned, and it leaves the door open for things like a holographic world and a holographic universe open, because what he did was he would run simulations of humans, and in any case when the actual reality was allowed open in the test of these simulated humans, when it was essentially what was actually out there was allowed to be known in these test fake AI versions of humanity, humanity would die out. So again, that just backed up his conclusion that he had already made, which is that our evolution did not put observing and seeing exactly what is in our reality as a priority at all. And that really opens the door, to me, it blows open the door to every possibility. And this is not some crazy fringe scientist, and I always want to make sure that I'm really clear about that. He's not someone that is just sort of labeled as some wacky guy, you know, kind of off on the sidelines. I mean, no, he's a very, very well-respected, very admired, cognitive scientist from one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And he's been, very quietly beating this drum for about 5 or 6 years now. And I think it's interesting because, if you read anything he's written or watch him speak, this is not where he ended up or wanted to be necessarily, or thought he would. This is not the reason. He didn't go into these experiments and into this research 3 decades ago thinking that he would come out of it realizing that humans do not see reality or perceive reality at all. This isn't where he thought he'd end up, but here he is, and I really admire him for not trying to bury it and instead, really talking about it in a really intelligent and very, I think, smart way. The way he conveys his message is not all doom and gloom. I mean, he's a very happy guy, and I can't say that all scientists or researchers in his position would, be able to smile if they thought that they figured out what he had figured out. But, I think that is a testament to the fact that maybe what is in the observable reality versus what's in the actual reality is not some scary, bad thing. And in fact, it's something exciting for us as humans to look into.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com